"You'll pay for this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the sterile silence of the community hall. "I'll own that house. I'll see it torn down to the foundation." I just stood there, watching as two state troopers cuffed her hands behind her back. Her perfectly manicured nails, the color of dried blood, scraped against the metal. Her face, usually a mask of smug superiority, was twisted into a grotesque snarl of pure, impotent rage. It was a fascinating sight, really. Like watching a predator realize it was caught in a trap it never even saw. The funny thing was, this whole mess, this spectacular downfall playing out under the unforgiving fluorescent lights in front of our stunned neighbors, didn't start with state troopers or felony charges. It started with something much smaller. It started with a piece of rust-colored history and the woman who decided it had to go. My name is Mark, and for 25 years, my job was to put people like Carol behind bars. I was a senior prosecutor for the state's Environmental Protection Division. My world was one of parts per billion, illegal discharge permits, and corporations that treated rivers like their own private sewers. I dealt with facts, data, and the cold, hard letter of the law. It was a job that rewarded patience and meticulous attention to detail, two traits that would serve me better than I could ever have imagined. After my wife, Sarah, passed away, the big house in the city felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. Every room echoed with her absence. I needed a change, a place where the silence was peaceful instead of haunting. I found it in a small house nestled in a development called Whispering Pines Estates, about an hour outside the city. It was the house my grandfather had built, the one I inherited but had never lived in. It backed onto a state forest, and it had a deep, artesian well that he had been immensely proud of. The well was my anchor to the past, a tangible link to the men who taught me how to fish and how to tell the difference between a real apology and a fake one. Capping the wellhead was a beautiful, antique hand pump, all cast iron and weathered charm. It hadn't drawn water in 50 years, but my grandfather had kept it there for sentimental reasons. To me, it was a monument. It was family. Whispering Pines Estates, I soon discovered, was less about whispering pines and more about screaming rules. The homeowners association was governed by a set of bylaws so thick they could stop a small caliber bullet. The queen of this tiny, manicured kingdom was Carol Peterson. She was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it had been sculpted from lemon meringue and an expression that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. I met her on my third day. I was outside, trying to coax a sad-looking rose bush back to life, when her shadow fell over me. She was holding a clipboard, which I would learn was a permanent extension of her arm. "Mr. Collins," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just Mark is fine," I replied, wiping dirt from my hands onto my jeans. "The HOA board requires all new residents to have an orientation meeting to review the community covenants and aesthetic standards," she announced, her eyes scanning my property with the precision of a targeting system. They landed on the old water pump. Her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "I've read the bylaws," I said. "All 300 pages of them. Fascinating stuff." My sarcasm was a finely honed tool from years in the courtroom, but it sailed right over her lacquered hair. "Good. Then you'll understand that unapproved structures are not permitted. That thing," she said, gesturing to my grandfather's pump with a flick of her pen, "will have to be removed." I looked at the pump, its rusty handle pointing towards the sky like a silent accusation. Then I looked back at her. "That's not a structure, Carol. It's a decoration. And it's staying." Her smile was thin and sharp, like a paper cut. "All exterior modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, of which I am the chair. It's an eyesore, and it lowers property values. You have 14 days to remove it, or you will be fined." She tapped her clipboard, turned on her heel, and marched away. That was it. That was the first shot fired. I didn't know it then, but she had just declared war. And she had declared it on a man who had spent his entire career turning bullies with a god complex into convicted felons. I went back to my roses, a small, weary smile on my face. This was going to be interesting. The first fine arrived exactly 15 days later, delivered by certified mail. $100 for failure to comply with aesthetic standards. I wrote a check for my monthly HOA dues but deliberately excluded the fine. I enclosed a polite, legally precise letter explaining that the pump was a pre-existing fixture, grandfathered in long before the HOA was even incorporated, and therefore not subject to the current bylaws. I cited the relevant property laws and even included a copy of the original deed. I thought a logical, fact-based argument would be the end of it. I was wrong. Dealing with Carol, I was learning, was like arguing with a brick wall. A very loud, very confident brick wall. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one contained a second fine for $200, the original $100 plus a late fee, and a letter from Carol, personally signed in a looping, aggressive script. My spurious legal claims, she wrote, were irrelevant. The committee's decision was final. The pump had to go. This was the point where most people would probably give in. It was just a stupid pump, right? Easier to just rip it out than deal with the headache. But it wasn't about the pump anymore. It was about the principle. It was about a woman who had crowned herself queen of a half-acre kingdom and expected everyone to bow. My grandfather used to say, never let a bully win the small fights, or they'll just start bigger ones. The fines kept coming, doubling each time. They were posted on the community bulletin board in the clubhouse, my name and address listed under a heading of delinquent accounts. It was public shaming, plain and simple. Neighbors started giving me sympathetic but distant looks. They knew she was a tyrant, but nobody wanted to end up on her list. They were a community held hostage by clipboards and bylaws. I ignored the notices. I kept paying my dues, and I kept sending letters, building a paper trail that would be comical if it weren't so infuriating. I documented every interaction, every letter, every passive-aggressive newsletter entry about maintaining our shared community values. I was operating on muscle memory, building a case file out of habit more than anything else. The escalation came on a Tuesday morning. I let my golden retriever, Buster, out into the fenced backyard as I did every morning. He was an old dog, a gentle soul Sarah and I had adopted years ago. He had a big water bowl on the patio that I filled from a hose connected directly to the well system. The well water was pristine. I'd had it tested when I moved in. It was cold, clean, and free of the chemical tang of city water. A few hours later, I found Buster lying on the cool tile of the kitchen floor, whining softly. He was lethargic, and he refused his favorite treat. Then he started vomiting. I rushed him to the vet, my heart pounding against my ribs with a familiar, dreadful rhythm. The vet ran some tests and told me it was some kind of poisoning. Not rat poison, but something industrial. A solvent or a pesticide, maybe. He asked if Buster could have gotten into anything in the garage. No, I said, my mind racing. Nothing. Everything is locked up tight. We got Buster treated. He had to stay overnight on N4, but the vet was optimistic he'd make a full recovery. I drove home in a cold fury, the vet's words echoing in my head. A solvent or a pesticide. My gaze fell on the wellhead in the backyard, my grandfather's pump standing sentinel over it. A dark, ugly suspicion began to coalesce in my mind, forming a knot of ice in my stomach. It was a wild leap, a paranoid fantasy. But was it? I thought about Carol's escalating obsession, her unhinged fixation on my property. Could she be that vindictive? That evil? That was the moment the switch flipped. This was no longer a petty squabble over HOA rules. This was an attack. She had come onto my property, trespassed on my land, and poisoned my water. She had hurt my dog. The peace-seeking widower was gone. In his place stood a prosecutor. Carol Peterson had just become the defendant in the most important case of my career, and she didn't even know it. The first thing I did when I got home from the vet was to go straight to my well. I pulled a sterile sample bottle from a case I kept in my garage, old habits die hard, and took a water sample directly from the spigot. I labeled it, dated it, and placed it in a cooler. Then I went to the big box store and bought 3 high-definition, motion-activated wildlife cameras. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting them up. One was hidden in the dense foliage of a rhododendron bush, aimed directly at the wellhead. Another was mounted high in the branches of an old oak tree, giving a wider, overhead view of my entire backyard. The third I placed near the side gate, the only logical entry point from her property. They were small, camouflaged, and utterly silent. If she came back, I would see her. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and started my investigation. I pulled up the HOA's public filings. I reviewed their budget, their vendor contracts, their meeting minutes. I was looking for anything, a crack in the facade. On the surface, everything looked clean. But Carol's name was everywhere. She was not only the president but also the treasurer. She had sole signing authority on the bank accounts. A massive red flag. The next morning, I drove the water sample to a private lab I had used for years in my professional capacity. I paid for a rush analysis, asking them to run a full-spectrum screening for volatile organic compounds, pesticides, and heavy metals. I didn't tell them it was my water. To them, it was just another sample, another job number. While I waited for the results, I called an old friend. Dave was a retired hydrogeologist for the state, one of the best I'd ever worked with. He knew more about groundwater than anyone I knew. "Mark. Good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you?" he boomed over the phone. "It's not retirement, Dave, it's a sabbatical." "And it's been eventful," I said. I explained the situation, from the HOA dispute to Buster getting sick. I didn't mention my suspicions about Carol. I just framed it as a mysterious contamination event. "Huh. That's nasty stuff," he said after I described the dog's symptoms. "Sounds like something from the organophosphate family. Common in older, nastier pesticides. Stuff you definitely don't want in your drinking water. Where did you say this well was?" I gave him the address. I could hear him typing on his keyboard. "Okay, I'm looking at the geological survey maps for your area," he said after a moment. "You're sitting on a shallow aquifer, pretty isolated. It's unlikely to be agricultural runoff, you're too far from any farms. And there are no old industrial sites nearby. If you've got contaminants, it's almost certainly a point source. Meaning someone put it there." His words confirmed my darkest fears. That's what I was afraid of. "Send me the lab results when you get them," he said. "I can tell you what you're dealing with, maybe even trace the specific product. And Mark, be careful. People who poison wells aren't playing games." The lab called 2 days later. My blood ran cold as the technician read the results over the phone. The water was laced with diazinon, a powerful insecticide. It was an older chemical, mostly phased out for residential use because of its toxicity, but still available in some commercial-grade products. The concentration wasn't high enough to be immediately lethal to a human, but it was well over the EPA's maximum contaminant level. It was more than enough to make a dog, or a child, violently ill. And prolonged exposure could cause severe neurological damage. The report was the first official piece of evidence. I had my baseline. Now I just needed to catch the perpetrator. I checked the cameras every morning. For a week, all I captured were raccoons, a curious deer, and my neighbor's cat. Carol was quiet. The fines stopped. I started to wonder if I had been wrong, if Buster's illness had been a horrible coincidence. Then, on the 9th night, I got her. I downloaded the memory card from the camera in the rhododendron bush and clicked open the video file. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. The night vision footage was grainy but perfectly clear. A figure, bundled in a dark hooded sweatshirt, crept through the side gate. The person moved with a strange, furtive confidence, like they knew exactly where they were going. The figure approached the wellhead, pulled a small plastic bottle from their pocket, unscrewed the cap, and carefully poured the contents down the narrow gap around the well casing. Then, the figure looked up, almost directly at the camera. The hood fell back for just a second, and the infrared light illuminated the unmistakable, hate-filled face of Carol Peterson. A wave of cold, clean fury washed over me. It was the same feeling I got in the courtroom when a defendant's carefully constructed lies finally crumbled. It was the feeling of certainty. I had her. The video was my smoking gun. I saved the file in 3 different places: a secure cloud server, an encrypted hard drive, and a thumb drive I kept in a safe deposit box. This was no longer an HOA dispute. This was a felony crime. Aggravated assault, poisoning a food or water supply. The list of charges was already scrolling through my head like a stock ticker. But I didn't go to the police. Not yet. Going to the local cops felt like using a fly swatter to take down a dragon. They would see a neighborhood squabble. They might bungle the evidence collection. No, this was my area of expertise. Carol wasn't just some criminal, she was my criminal. And I was going to build a case against her that was so airtight, so perfectly constructed, that she would never see the light of day again. This had to be done right. My plan started to form, not as a simple act of revenge, but as a professional project. I would treat my own poisoning as a state-level environmental crime. I would be the lead investigator, the prosecutor, and the victim, all rolled into one. The goal wasn't just to get her arrested. The goal was poetic justice. I would use the very tools of her petty tyranny, the rules, the meetings, the public scrutiny, to orchestrate her downfall. The first step was to bait the trap. I needed her to do it again, but this time I needed to be prepared to collect even more definitive evidence. I sent a new letter to the HOA board, this time registered and with return receipt requested. In it, I formally challenged the legality of the accumulated fines, stating my intent to seek a legal remedy if they were not rescinded. I also included a line that I knew would drive her insane. I wrote, "Furthermore, I have reason to believe that a member of this community may be engaged in illicit activities on my property, and I have taken steps to document any and all future incursions." It was a calculated risk. I was waving a red flag in front of an already enraged bull. I was counting on her arrogance, on her belief that she was untouchable. I was betting she would see my letter not as a warning, but as a challenge. While I waited for her to take the bait, I upgraded my surveillance. I bought a fourth camera, a top-of-the-line model with crystal-clear 4K resolution and color night vision. I mounted it inside my house, looking out a back window, providing an overlapping field of view with the other cameras. I also purchased a set of time-lapse soil probes, designed to detect chemical changes in the ground. I placed them in a grid around the wellhead, hidden just below the surface. If she spilled anything, I would know exactly what it was and where it went. Every evening, I would go through my ritual. I'd take a new water sample, label it, and log it in a chain of custody document I had created. I downloaded the footage from the cameras. I checked the soil probes. I was methodical, patient. I was hunting. The response to my letter came 5 days later. It was a furious, rambling 2-page screed, signed by Carol. She accused me of slander, of threatening the board, and of being a disruptive element in the community. The fines were not only upheld, she wrote, but a special assessment of $1,000 was being levied against my property for legal consultation fees, and then came the line I was waiting for. "Your empty threats about documentation are noted," she wrote. "Rest assured, the HOA will also be documenting your continued violations." She was coming. I could feel it. Her rage and arrogance wouldn't let her stay away. She had to have the last word. She had to win. 2 nights later, she did. The cameras caught it all, this time in stunning, high-definition color. She was wearing the same dark hoodie, but she was angrier, sloppier. She wasn't carrying a small bottle this time. She was lugging a 1-gallon jug with the label clearly visible in the enhanced night vision. Ground clear commercial herbicide. It was a toxic cocktail of glyphosate and imazapyr, chemicals that persist in the soil and water for years. She didn't just pour it carefully this time. She unscrewed the cap and violently dumped the entire gallon down the well casing. She splashed it all over the concrete well cap and the surrounding grass. It was an act of pure, unrestrained malice. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, before turning and disappearing back into the darkness. I had it. I had everything. High-resolution video of the act. A clear shot of the product label. I had my chain of custody for the water samples. The soil probes were already sending data to my laptop, showing a massive spike in specific chemical signatures. The case was hermetically sealed. But I still wasn't ready to go to the authorities. The arrest was just one part of the plan. Her humiliation had to be public. It had to happen in front of the very people she had terrorized for years. I used an obscure clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed any member to call an emergency meeting if they could demonstrate a clear and present danger to the community's health and safety. I drafted a formal request for a meeting to discuss urgent groundwater contamination issues in Whispering Pines. I attached a copy of the first lab report, the one showing the diazinon, but redacted my name and address, presenting it as an anonymous sample from within the community. I sent it to the entire HOA board and posted a copy on the community bulletin board. Carol had no choice but to schedule the meeting. To refuse would be an admission of negligence. A notice went out, a mandatory community meeting would be held in the clubhouse in 3 days' time. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the rat to walk into it. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Fear is a powerful motivator. The idea that the water under their manicured lawns might be poisoned had brought out everyone, from the young families to the elderly retirees. The air was thick with anxiety and whispered rumors. I sat in the back, watching Carol at the front of the room. She was trying to project an aura of calm authority, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted the microphone. She knew this was about my anonymous report. She just didn't know what I knew. She opened the meeting with condescending platitudes. Now, let's not panic. We have received an unsubstantiated report of a potential water issue. I want to assure everyone that your board is handling the situation. I let her talk for a few minutes, let her dig her own grave a little deeper. Then, I raised my hand. Carol, I said, my voice calm and carrying easily through the quiet room. You call the report unsubstantiated. I have it right here. It was performed by a state-certified laboratory. It shows dangerous levels of diazinon, a highly toxic insecticide. I think the community deserves to know how seriously you're taking a potential public health crisis. All heads turned towards me, then back to her. A murmur went through the crowd. Carol's face flushed a blotchy red. As I said, the report is anonymous and therefore cannot be verified. For all we know, you created it yourself to get out of your fines. The accusation hung in the air. This was the moment. The first reveal. That's a serious allegation, Carol, I said, standing up and walking slowly towards the front of the room. I held up a folder. But let's talk about the science, shall we? Diazinon contamination at these levels suggests direct, intentional dumping, not runoff. It's a criminal act. It means we have someone in our neighborhood, right now, who is willing to poison a water source. That's not just an HOA violation. That's a felony. I didn't present the video. I didn't even mention it. I just presented the cold, hard facts of the water analysis. I passed out copies of the lab report. I explained what the chemical was, what it did to the human body. I spoke with the calm authority of a man who had done this 100 times before in a courtroom. I was sowing the seeds of doubt, not about me, but about her leadership. Panic began to ripple through the room. People were looking at their neighbors, at their glasses of water on the tables. Carol saw she was losing control. She slammed her hand on the table. This is a scare tactic. This man is a known troublemaker who has refused to follow our community's rules. He's trying to deflect from his own violations. This meeting is over. But it was too late. The damage was done. People weren't looking at me like a troublemaker anymore. They were looking at her like a leader who was either incompetent or, worse, hiding something. Her desperate, angry denial had cracked her facade of control. She had reacted exactly as I had predicted. The community's trust in her was fractured. And a fractured foundation is the first step to a total collapse. I knew Carol wouldn't take this lying down. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and I had just backed her into a very public corner. Her response was faster and more vicious than I had anticipated. She went nuclear. The very next morning, 2 sheriff's deputies were at my door. They looked uncomfortable, like they knew they were being used as pawns in a neighborhood war. Mr. Mark Collins, the older one asked. Yes. How can I help you, officers? We've received a complaint, he said, avoiding my eyes. An anonymous tip that you've been improperly disposing of chemical waste on your property. We need to have a look around. It was a classic move. Accuse your accuser of the very thing you did. I smiled. Of course, officers. Please, come in. You can look anywhere you like. I have nothing to hide. I led them through the house and out to the backyard. I pointed to the well. This is my water source. I can assure you, I'm not foolish enough to dump chemicals anywhere near it. They did a cursory search, found nothing, and left with polite apologies. But the purpose wasn't to find anything. The purpose was the spectacle. The purpose was for my neighbors to see a sheriff's car in my driveway. Within an hour, a post appeared on the Whispering Pines community social media page, written by Carol. "Concerned residents," it began, in all caps. "It has come to my attention that the resident responsible for the recent water scare had a visit from the sheriff's department this morning regarding illegal dumping. It seems we may have found the source of our contamination. Please be vigilant and report any suspicious activity." It was a masterpiece of slander, a smear campaign designed to destroy my credibility completely. The comments section exploded. Some people defended me, but many more, whipped into a frenzy of fear, turned on me. I was accused of everything from trying to lower property values so I could buy up cheap land, to being a government plant sent to take over the HOA. It was insane. She was trying to bury me in lies, to paint me as the villain before I could expose her as the monster. She was also trying to get me fired, I learned later. She had called my old office, ranting to the receptionist that one of their prosecutors was a known polluter. Thankfully, my old boss knew me better and dismissed her as a crank. But her campaign of harassment was escalating. She was digging her own grave faster and faster. And then, she handed me the shovel. Or rather, her son did. I received an anonymous email late one night. The subject line was just, "Whispering Pines." The message was short and to the point. "I think my mom is the one poisoning your well. There are jugs of ground clear herbicide in our garage. She's been acting crazy ever since you moved in. I don't know what to do." My heart skipped a beat. This was the whistleblower. The final, unimpeachable piece of the puzzle. The corroborating witness. I wrote back carefully. "Thank you for reaching out. Your courage is commendable. I am not the police, but I am building a case. Any information you have could be crucial. If you are willing, I would like to talk." He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in the next town over. He was a kid, maybe 20 years old, home from college for the summer. He had his mother's eyes, but none of her malice. He just looked scared and ashamed. "My name is Leo," he said, not meeting my gaze. "My mom. She's always been controlling, but this is different. She's obsessed with you and that stupid pump. I heard her on the phone, bragging to her friend about how she was going to teach you a lesson you'd never forget. He told me he'd seen the jugs of herbicide in the garage. He'd seen her sneaking out late at night. He'd seen my name on the community webpage and put two and two together. She's my mom," he said, his voice cracking. "But what she's doing. It's wrong. It's dangerous." "Leo," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I know this is hard. But I need to ask if you would be willing to give a formal, signed statement to law enforcement about what you've seen and heard." He hesitated, the weight of betraying his own mother settling on his young shoulders. He looked at me, and I didn't see a prosecutor or a victim. I just saw a man trying to do the right thing. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I will." That was it. That was the final nail. I had her on high-definition video. I had forensic evidence. And now, I had an eyewitness from inside her own house. The case wasn't just airtight anymore. It was a vacuum-sealed, lead-lined vault of pure, undeniable guilt. It was time. Time to stop being the investigator and start being the prosecutor. The next morning, I didn't call the local sheriff. I didn't call the county DA. I drove to the state capitol, to the building where I had worked for a quarter of a century. I walked into the office of the head of the Environmental Crimes Unit, a man I had trained 2 decades ago. "Mark," he said, surprised to see me. "What brings you out of retirement?" I placed a thick, neatly organized binder on his desk. "I'm not retired," I said. "And I'm bringing you a case." I laid it all out for him. The binder contained everything: the timeline of harassment, copies of the fines, the lab reports, high-resolution stills from the videos, my chain of custody logs, the soil probe data, and a summary of Leo's expected testimony. I had even cross-referenced the chemical batch numbers from the herbicide jug with local distributors to show she had purchased it 2 months prior. I handed him the encrypted thumb drive containing the video files. He spent an hour going through it, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and finally to a grim, professional resolve. When he was done, he looked up at me. My God, Mark. You gift-wrapped it. This is one of the cleanest cases of intentional contamination I've ever seen. I want her to be made an example of, I said, my voice low and steady. I want every HOA president with a God complex in this state to see what happens when they cross the line from petty tyrant to felon. Oh, she will be, he said, picking up his phone. We're going to take this. The state police will handle the arrest. We'll coordinate with the county sheriff. This woman isn't just facing assault charges. Under state environmental law, knowingly poisoning a potable water source carries a mandatory minimum sentence. She's going to prison for a very long time. The wheels of justice, once I finally set them in motion, moved with terrifying speed. My friend at the EPA worked with the state police to plan the final act. It wouldn't be a quiet arrest at her home. It would be public. It would be a spectacle. It would be exactly what she deserved. They decided to use her own weapon against her, a mandatory community meeting. The official notice went out on state letterhead. It announced a public health emergency briefing regarding the significant and ongoing groundwater contamination in Whispering Pines Estates. Attendance was strongly encouraged. The venue was the same clubhouse where she had tried to shout me down. The night of the final showdown was electric. This time, it wasn't just anxious residents. In the back of the room stood 2 uniformed state troopers, a plainclothes detective from the Environmental Crimes Unit, and the county sheriff. Their presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room from one of neighborhood drama to one of grave importance. Carol was at the front again, but this time she was seated at the table, not standing behind the podium. She looked pale and drawn. She had clearly been advised that state authorities were now involved, but she couldn't possibly know the depth of the evidence against her. She still thought this was a fight she could win with bluster and lies. A senior agent from the state EPA took the podium first. He was a man with a grim face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He put up a presentation on a large screen, showing geological maps of our neighborhood and explaining the aquifer. Then he put up the chemical analysis from my well. What we have here, he said, his voice booming through the silent room, is a deliberate and malicious poisoning of a private well with a cocktail of dangerous chemicals. These substances can cause neurological damage, liver failure, and have been linked to certain types of cancer. This was not an accident. This was an attempt to cause serious bodily harm. A wave of gasps and horrified murmurs swept through the audience. People were looking at their neighbors, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. Who among them was a monster? The agent then turned and looked directly at me. The owner of the property, Mr. Mark Collins, brought this to our attention. He is a former prosecutor with our agency, and his meticulous documentation is the reason we are able to act so swiftly. Mr. Collins, would you be willing to walk us through the timeline of events? This was it. The moment of truth. I walked to the podium, the thick binder in my hand. I felt a strange sense of calm, the same pretrial focus I had felt 1,000 times before. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. Then my eyes landed on Carol. Her face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. I started at the beginning. It began with a notice about an old water pump, I said, my voice even and clear. I told them about the fines, the harassment, the public shaming. I laid out the pattern of escalation, calmly and factually. I believed it was a simple case of an overzealous HOA president. I was wrong. Then I talked about Buster getting sick. I could hear a few people gasp. That's when I began to suspect the problem was not with the pump, but with the well itself. So, I did what I was trained to do. I gathered evidence. I clicked a button on the laptop connected to the projector. The screen changed from the chemical analysis to a still image from the first video. A grainy, night vision shot of a hooded figure at my well. On this date, I said, my cameras captured this individual trespassing on my property and pouring an unknown substance into my well. Carol shot to her feet. This is outrageous. That could be anyone. This is a fabrication. The state police detective took a step forward. Ma'am, please sit down. You will have a chance to speak. She sat, but her eyes were wild with panic. She's right, I said calmly. The quality is poor. It's hard to be certain who that is. Which is why I upgraded my equipment and waited. Because I knew the perpetrator was arrogant. I knew they would be back. I clicked the button again. The screen lit up with crystal clear, 4K color night vision footage. The entire room could see Carol Peterson, her face illuminated as if by a spotlight, hauling a gallon jug of ground-clear herbicide. They watched in stunned silence as she dumped the contents into my well, her face contorted in a sneer of pure hatred. I let the video play in a loop. The image of her, caught in the act, poisoning the water, was undeniable. It was absolute. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the silence of a community realizing they had been living next to a monster, had been ruled by her, had been intimidated by her. Carol completely unraveled. The carefully constructed facade of the respectable community leader shattered into a million pieces, revealing the shrieking, hate-filled creature beneath. "It's a fake," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "He faked it. He's a liar. He's been trying to destroy this community since he moved in." The detective stepped forward again. "Carol Peterson," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You need to remain silent." But she couldn't. Her rage and her terror were a runaway train. She turned her fury on me. "You and your stupid, rusty junk. All of this because you wouldn't follow the rules. You deserved it. You deserved it for disrespecting the rules. That pump was an eyesore." And there it was. A full confession, bellowed in a room full of 24 witnesses and 4 armed law enforcement officers. The final, self-inflicted blow. The detective didn't even have to say anything. He just nodded to the 2 troopers, who moved towards her with a practiced, almost bored efficiency. "Carol Peterson," the detective said, his voice cutting through her frantic denials. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault, criminal mischief, and multiple violations of the State Environmental Protection Act. You have the right to remain silent." As they pulled her arms behind her back to apply the handcuffs, her eyes locked with mine. The rage was still there, but now it was laced with the cold, stark terror of ultimate defeat. "You'll pay for this," she hissed, the words that would echo in my mind for a long time. "I'll own that house. I'll see it torn down to the foundation." It was the last, hollow threat of a queen who had just been deposed, a tyrant whose reign was over. They led her out of the clubhouse, her shrieks echoing behind her, leaving a room full of shell-shocked residents in her wake. The show was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The community was, for a time, in chaos. The HOA board resigned en masse, either out of shame or fear. But then, something remarkable happened. People started talking to each other. Neighbors who had been pitted against one another by Carol's reign of terror began to reconnect. A special election was held, and a new board was voted in, comprised of sensible, reasonable people who immediately began the process of dismantling Carol's labyrinthine book of ridiculous rules. The covenant about aesthetic standards was the first to go. Carol's fate was exactly what she had earned. Faced with the mountain of incontrovertible evidence, she had no choice but to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to multiple felonies. Her husband, a quiet man who had been either oblivious or complicit, divorced her during the proceedings. They had to sell their house, the one with the perfect lawn and the HOA-approved mailbox, to pay her legal fees and the massive civil penalties levied by the EPA. A significant portion of that money was court-ordered restitution to me, to pay for the complete remediation of my well and the surrounding soil, a process that took months and cost a small fortune. She was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with a mandatory minimum of 5 before she was even eligible for parole. Her picture was in the local paper, a mugshot that showed a woman stripped of her power, her hair a mess, her eyes empty. The Queen was now just another inmate in a beige jumpsuit. I used the restitution money to install a state-of-the-art, whole-house water filtration and purification system. It was probably overkill, but it gave me peace of mind. The environmental cleanup crew did their work, and within a year, my well water was testing cleaner than it had been before the poisoning. Buster made a full recovery. He was old and a little slower, but he was happy. He spent his afternoons snoozing in the sun on the patio, not far from the wellhead. And the old, cast-iron water pump. It's still there. It stands exactly where my grandfather left it, a silent monument to a battle that was never really about the pump at all. It was about a bully who met someone who refused to back down. It was about the simple truth that the law, when wielded with patience and precision, is the great equalizer. Sometimes, my new neighbors, the ones who now wave when I walk Buster down the street, will stop and ask me about what happened. They see me as some kind of hero, the quiet man who slayed the dragon. But I don't see it that way. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone, who was pushed too far. I didn't seek out the fight, but when it came to my door, I used the skills I had to finish it. Justice, I've found, is a lot like water. It can be dammed up, diverted, and polluted for a time. But eventually, it always finds its level. And in Whispering Pines, the water finally runs clean. I finally have the peace I came here for, a quiet forged not in the absence of conflict, but in its absolute and final resolution.